Hello, and welcome to Radical Engagement. Today we're reading Rob Urie's Is It Fascism Yet? Which is available, I believe, for free at his Substack, the Journal of Belligerent Pontification. I also believe there's a paywall version of it over at Counterpunch magazine. I personally like to deal with discussions of quote fascism because it is a hot button issue that ranges between political relevance and historiographic relevance, and because of the way it is also like the universal bad thing in the 20th century American consciousness, it's a debate where the historiographic questions and the political questions are confused and maybe even deliberately muddled. So we're going in with that suspicion. Rob Urie, as far as I know, is the author of a book called Sin Economics, which I have not read. He's also an artist and musician, and seems like a general curmudgeon of the vaguely left wing variety. He seems to be a little older than me. I've read some of his work before and have enjoyed it. All right, let's pick this up. Is it fascism yet? A history of the Americans creating what they purport to abhor. Dear readers, the role of fascism in recent American discourse has been to pose an absolute evil with an apparent purpose of mustering social resources to fight it. Asterisk, Antifa, all the conservative ad Hitlerum, etc. It is the political evil. It has also been a potent tool used to frighten well-to-do Americans as supporting domestic political repression, including the dissemination of state propaganda, censorship of dissent, and removal of public protections from excessive police power. This is why I'm talking ironic that, but I think Urie's right. As this piece lays out, that doesn't mean that there is no substance to the charge. The U.S. has a long and complicated relationship with European fascists of the 20th century. Asterisk, as do social democrats, as do revolutionary conservative movements. There's fascism pulls from so many different political traditions, particularly in its Italian form, that and including basic both old liberalism and progressive liberalism, that it's really hard to completely deal with it. The kind of it is an expansion of the inconsistencies of Bonapartism is one way of looking at fascism from a Marxist perspective. That it's an attempt to order in a disordered cycle of capital. This is a view of Claire Mattei. It's also a view of certain other historical Marxist thinkers. I might need to go into the various theories of fascism, including Marxist, and then there's the reality as written by Sev Sternhell about the way in which social democracy actually contributed to the theoretical developments of fascism quite directly, including parts of the quote ultra left parts of the Italian uh, socialist movement, and how they flipped. So, but there's also a direct relationship to the United States in a real way, and it's something that people in the U.S. are broadly uncomfortable with, although it does seem to finally be getting some real uh, attention. I think why people are so uncomfortable with it is that it also hits both political traditions in the United States. It doesn't just hit the conservatives or the segregationists or even the neo-Confederates, although those are major contributors to what would become fascism. To call those fascists, I think, is a little confused. I tend to agree with Daniel Besner on this. Nonetheless, they are fascist adjacent enough that we can call them fascistic or proto-fascist or something like that if you want to. There's enough of the core of fascism that's developed in these other separate American political movements that you have to look at it and kind of feel uncomfortable. My purpose is back to Urie. My purpose in addressing fascism once again is to take it out of the American view that it is a matter of moral and political bankrupt personal beliefs to place it in an economic history as political economy. Yeah, which is what you should do. Good job, Urie. The German fascists in particular look to American history as a model for National Socialism, Nazism, particularly parts of the Hitlerist variety of it, actually. This hardly makes the Americans responsible for the rise of German fascism, except to the extent that the prominent American U.S. corporations supported its rise. But the prominent European corporations also supported its rise. It was part of a thing. Conflation of the U.S. uniparty electoral system with the parliamentary system poses Democrats and Republicans as political opponents when they jointly act as tools of American capital. I mean, I think that's true in parliamentary systems too, Urie. Sorry on that. That's not unique to us. It's just particularly bad because our false choices are limited even comparatively. This distinction without a difference between the American parties leaves a perpetual choice between two dedicated servants of capital. Although which parts of capital they serve is different, Urie, that has to be addressed. Adds back into American imperialism, and the differences between the candidates and parties shrink even more. Asterisk. This is a standard, soft Marxist view from Marxist Leninist to even like ultra leftist. I think there's truth to it in broad strokes, but in specific strokes, it's actually still a little confused. It doesn't recognize that capital itself is uneven and divided amongst subclasses and amongst different sectors. And if you don't deal with that and understanding political, you think that the entire system intention is fake. It's not fake. They really are fighting, but they're not fighting for us. They're fighting for different sectors of capital. If you take the little bit of Marxist theory on the state, which is woefully underdeveloped because Marx and Engels didn't really get to it, even if you see it as a ruling committee of the bourgeoisie, what they are ruling is tensions within different parts of the bourgeoisie. Yes, it is the dictatorship of capital, but there are winners and losers of capital in that game. And if you think it's just fake or it's just, unilateral, you're not going to understand what's actually going on. Which is also what's interesting about what's implied in Claire Mattei's book about this subject. The capital. Let me give it out. Where is it? The capo order. It's back there. In fact, it's in that far corner over there. The capital order, because it's also implicit in this that U.S. progressivism and Bretton Woods style Keynesianism, as led by the British, served a similar function to fascism, but less brutally, with less obvious brutal repression as part of their mechanism. Interestingly, it's actually weirdly third period Marxist Leninists and conservatives who point this out. There's a book by Schultbach, I believe. By Green goes by Wolfgang Swivelbush, excuse me, not Schultbach, which actually makes this contention, although this book is led by libertarians, which tells you it's biased, but it's actually got a very similar thesis to Marxist, except it thinks the state is in crisis and not capital. But it actually illustrates that pretty convincingly to me that what U.S. Roosevelt saw progressivism and what Keynesianism in Britain actually ultimately aimed in doing was to stabilize an unstable capital order. and to win back parts of the population before you had another Bolshevik style revolution. And that was part of the justification back in the day, if you remember such things, for why in the third period, it's part of why the accusation of social democrats being social fascist was actually come up with. Now there's a lot more there. A lot of it was opportunistic bullshit on the part of Marxist Leninist, but it's something you need to understand when you're trying to contextualize this period in particular. All right. So that's all subtext for what we're dealing here with Urie. All right, I'm going to have to go in and out of this show because there are going to eventually be some things to look at and consider. All right. So this is the piece proper. We've gone through the pretext there and the standard view. Is fascism merely a dictatorial force in service of capitalism? That may not be all it is, but that is certainly an important part of what fascism's raison d'etre. The function of Hitler himself kept referring to when he talked about saving the industrialists and the bankers from the Bolsheviks. Michael Parenti, Black Shirts and Reds. Yeah, that's sloppy. This part of Parenti I've never been particularly convinced by. Yes, Hitler was out to save the industrialists and bankers from the Bolsheviks, and yes, he actually fought against Strasserites and other more Italian influenced style fascists. In fact, it was not clear that the Italian fascists and the Hitler and Nazism was even going to be allies. There was part of the capitalist order, but there was also a condemnation of capitalism in favor of entrepreneurialism picked up in both Hitler and in Werner Sombart, the former Marxist turned Nazi. All right. Parenti kind of hand waves that. Yes, this was about asserting a part of the capital order ultimately, but that's not how the fascists themselves saw it, even if that's what they were doing. Now, the ideology needs to be separated from the function, right? So we have to take that in mind when we see a quote like that. The question of fascism in the US of A is both tedious and necessary because of the ways in which the term has been weaponized in recent years. It is tedious in the 99.8% or so of commenters using the term emerge from a particular hegemonic framework, liberal/idealist, that excludes relevant information regarding fascist practice and violence. 100% agree, Urie. This creates a other than Miss Lincoln, how did you enjoy the play gap and the Western narratives purporting to explain it? It also leaves behind the sense, as with mainstream accounts of the U.S. proxy war in Ukraine, that the veracity of analysis is limited by the way in which the problems they purport to address are framed. Absolutely. For example, does NATO even want the Ukrainians to win? Or was it just there to bleed the Russians and shift the global political order and maybe stall the Belt and Road Initiative at the expense of Ukrainian society and blood? Perhaps. It's a possibility. Not that the West started it, but they sure set up the conditions of the bait, didn't they? Anyway, back to this. Because how this question of fascism is framed substantively determines the range of information that emerges from analysis. Strong claims one way or another become a function of how the questions are asked rather than simply revealing the truth of history. For instance, following from World War I, German anti-Semitism was fed through the conflation of Jewishness with Bolshevism. Absolutely. This is first to be interned into German concentration camps with the German communists, not the Jews as might be imagined today. It was the German communists, social democrats, and some Poles originally, actually. A question worth asking then is, why is one group considered worthy victims while the other is considered good riddance? Well, I mean, that's pretty clear why that is the case. The American take on European fascism of the 20th century has been more focused on what was claimed to be historical breaks rather than continuities. Absolutely true. Great point, Urie. The former left conception of German fascism as radicalized capitalist imperialism, that's one of the conceptions, my friend. There's actually, I have a whole book on Marxist and left readings of fascism. There is not a consistent answer, even at the time period it was happening. A degenerated form of capitalism is given, but what that degeneration is and how it works is not given. But what's important, and I think this is the important thing to stress, and this is where I agree with Urie, it's in the development of things that were already happening in nation building and liberal societies under the capitalist world order and people encountering it. The former left conception of German fascism as racialized capitalist imperialism begs the question of which imperialism didn't develop its legitimating narratives that place their victims as victimizers. American slaves maintained that slavery elevated the slaves by exposing them to advanced culture to which the slaves could aspire. Depending on which historian you choose, the concept of race after emerged from American slavery or informed it. I don't think many people think the concept of race came from American slavery. I mean, the general consensus, even by critical race theorists, is it came from the transatlantic slave trade beginning with the Portuguese, which contributed to American slavery, but it's not like the primacy of America there is like actually Americans' own egoism. Whatever. Back to the text. Was European fashion then a historical break or continuity? In 1917, U.S. President, progressive Democrat, racist crank, and proto-fascist Woodrow Wilson created an anodyne-sounding Committee on Public Information to sell World War I to the American people. The committee later served as a model for the German fascist propaganda efforts. Wilson's progressive science substantially informed fascist race science. Absolutely, it did. The American eugenics program, and eugenics is actually way more ubiquitous, even in the Second International, than most of us are comfortable with. It was mostly positive eugenics and not the negative exterminationist eugenics, but not completely that. The American eugenics program informed the German fascist program to exterminate undesirables. It wasn't just the American program. It was all over the fucking place. But in the sense that America was developing and contributing to that, absolutely true. Wilson was still prosecuting the Indian Wars in the U.S. when the German fascists came to power. Also true. Little known. And in 1919, Wilson launched the Palmer Raids that rounded up American dissidents and put them in concentration camps then known as prisons. The Second Industrial Revolution in the U.S., 1860 or thereabouts, was contemporaneous with the launch in earnest of the Indian Wars. Absolutely. Prior to industrialization, federal plans have been to create side-by-side nations where the indigenous, tribes if you prefer, would rule themselves. However, industrialization led to the use of natural resources on a scale never before imagined. The U.S. had many natural resources needed for industrialization within its borders. The problem was that many of these resources were on land occupied by the indigenous. The Indian Wars were a form of internal imperialism, complete with rococo, race-based explanations for why these resources rightly belong to American industrialists. While simplified in a paragraph, there's nothing in that paragraph I disagree with or need to complicate. It's more or less true. Taken together and based on multiple accounts, including that of the contemporary American liberal Adam Tooze and The Wages of Destruction, the German fascists wanted to recreate what the Americans had been using the methods of the Americans had used. The German fascists wanted to recreate what the Americans had using the methods the Americans had used to create it. According to Tooze, the German fascists concluded that Germany lacked the quantity and variety of national resources needed to fulfill their ambitions to follow the American model of industrialization internally, also the British model and the French model. You need to add that to this. Germany was the major industrial power that didn't have an empire, or well, it did, but it was a very pathetic empire, as opposed because it consolidated later, as opposed to the settler colonial states, the United States and Mexico too, and a lot of Latin America, and the early consolidated nation states in Europe, France and England. Sometimes it's not all about us. Doesn't mean we aren't evil. I guess I'm not disagreeing with him. I just think as Americans, we tend to focus on the American part of this to shock ourselves, that we contributed to the development of fascism, which we absolutely did. And one of the things I do think Urie is right about, we need to look at the continuities with the development of liberal polities into what became fascism, not with this radical separation, because the radical separation is a more a matter of scale than of kind. And that should make people uncomfortable. According to Tooze, the German fascists concluded that Germany lacked the quantity and variety of natural resources to fulfill their ambitions to follow the American model of industrialization internally. Hence, their plan to conquer Europe, and in particular Russia, in order to take them. Yeah, they were basically going to settle or colonize the Slavic lands. That was their goal. And Werner Sombart, who wrote Why the Americans Aren't Socialists and all this stuff, was a Marxist, actually contributed intellectually to this project because he thought that the American settler program actually bought off class tensions. Mike Davis kind of agrees with him. To some degree, in a much more vulgar and less helpful way, so does Jay Sakai. Hence, their plan to conquer Europe, and in particular Russia, in order to take them. From the Marxist frame, the German fascists look like ordinary imperialists with a racialized component. Here's the thing. Marx's definition of imperialism in this time period was not settled. It just wasn't. But it was seen as an inevitable development of the monopoly capital powers developing in the late 19th century, and the way the state, which had always played a role in capital, I mean, from the enclosures forward, was becoming more and more of an adjudicator of things like limited liability corporations. And when people like Sombart got into this, they started bemoaning the death of the heroic entrepreneur versus the big industrial capitalist. Although the industrialists needed to be saved because we need, the nation needed industrial production. Not so much disagreeing with Urie, I'm just giving you the rest of the context. In 1917, we ruled Wilson, Jordin, the British, and the French, and sending troops. In Wilson's case, the American Expeditionary Force to manage the Bolshevik Revolution, as World War I became the first industrial war of attrition. I don't know. I think the Franco-Prussian War and the U.S. Civil War are the first industrial wars of attrition. But I'll just accept that. I'm not going to argue with that. That's a very small technicality. As a recent surge in Ukraine, global elites bickered as citizen soldiers were placed in front of a machine gun fire to die. Hence my question above. The class divide, where wealthy elites make the decisions, and the bank, while citizen soldiers are slaughtered in industrial care, led to the utter brutality of World War II. European fascism didn't arise in a vacuum, and much of the bitterness emerged from the slaughter of World War I. Yeah, duh. While American Jim Crow laws provided the model for German fascist race laws, yes, it did. American progressive race science, aka scientific racism, provided the pseudoscientific basis for the extermination of undesirables. The American eugenics laws, based on the progressive science, led to the involuntary sterilization of 70,000 poor women in the U.S. It's a shit ton in California, in particular. California is one of where the American progressive eugenics movement was really dominant. And again, the Indian Wars were still on their way in the U.S. when the German fascists began their ascent to power. As a side note, William Jennings Bryan, the guy who lost the Scots Monkey trial but was a progressive who did the Cross of Gold speech and kind of screwed the progressive movement with the the progressive and populist movement when he liquidated himself into the Democratic Party as sharecroppers were no longer enough of a political force to be an opposition party, third party of real power, which the Populist Party or the People's Party really was. Nonetheless, one of the things that William Jennings Bryan was worried about in the Scopes Monkey trial for all his fundamentalism was actually eugenics. He was an opponent of eugenics, which fundamentalist Christians bring up today dishonestly because they ignore the rest of William Jennings Bryan's politics, but that's part of what's going on here. The Jim Crow race laws and the progressive movement, the right and left wing of American politics of the 19th and early 20th century, actually is the basis for a whole lot of the race laws. Combine that with laws and codes done in British imperialism and in French imperialism, particularly after the Haitian Revolution, when the French get a lot nastier, and like Southeast Asia, you start seeing a trend. All right. I say this because, again, there's a tendency to focus on the Americans as the only model for this, as if this was not a broad European and post-European settler colonial project. Like, it was the project of building capitalist nations. Nationalism is rooted in this. Even in places that seem to have a homogenous population, that population is made homogenous. The German states were not homogenous. England was not homogenous and still isn't. Or if it is homogenous, it was racially kind of homogenous. Think about what that means. This is not to say that nationalism equals fascism or that capitalism equals nationalism, but it does seem that the bourgeois republic in the nation state since the Treaty of Westphalia does seem to mysteriously collide with the development of capitalism. Is it good or bad? You have to decide. All right, back to the thing here. Just agreeing with Jerry. And the Indian Wars were still on their way in the U.S. when the German fascists came to power. Add in U.S. imperialism, is ethos explicated below from the former General Smedley Butler. Oh boy, and the German fascist appears to be more historical continuity than a break. I think that Urie, I think you're right. I think you could prove this with better sources. Smedley Butler. All right. I love the book War's Racket, but there's a whole lot of questions around Smedley Butler. Anyway, let's read the quote. I spent 33 years and 4 months in the active military service, and during that period, I spent most of the time as a high-class muscleman for big business, for Wall Street and for bankers. In short, I was a racketeer, a gangster for capitalism. I helped make Mexico, and especially Tampico, safe for American oil interests in 1914. Good old Woodward Wilson's guns. I helped make Haiti and Cuba a decent place for national city bank boys to collect revenues in. I helped in the raping of half a dozen Central American republics for the benefit of Wall Street. Helped purify Nicaragua for all the international banking house of the Brown brothers in 1902 to 1912. I brought light to the Dominican Republic for American sugar interests in 1916. I helped make Honduras right for the American fruit companies in 1903. And in China in 1927, I helped see it that Standard Oil went its way unmolested. Looking back on it, I might have given Al Capone a few hints. The best he could do was to operate in his whacket in 3 districts. I operated on 3 continents. Former U.S. General Smedley Butler, War's Racket. That's why I love that book. Actually, that quote's great. For all my problems with Smedley Butler, that quote's great. Anyone who imagines that the imperial subjects from whom the former U.S. General Smedley brother refers to were treated decently as free citizens of their respective nations would be wrong. As referring to early imperial history, however, Howardson's A People's Republic of the United States. Urie, I agree with you, but you need to use better sources. All right. When it became clear there was no gold left, the Indians were taken as slave labor on huge estates known as encomiendas. They worked as furious and apace and died by the thousands. By the year 1515, there were approximately 50,000 Indians left. By 1550, there were 500. A report of the year 1650 shows that none of the original Arawaks and their descendants were left on the island. All right, so this is about the Caribbean, and it's about the Spanish. So just to put that in for you. Uh, indigenous labor was used as slave labor in the British colonies too. Don't think you got out of it. For example, in the reports of the Salem witch trial, the Tituba slave was not likely to be a black African. She was likely to be indigenous. I think it's 100% certain she was indigenous. And so we have to remind ourselves of that, right? The importation of black slaves seems to be partly done because the nations, the indigenous nations that were strong, could actually resist, in so much like the Cherokee and the Muskogee peoples, etc., to use our names for them. But the smallpox virus had decimated the East Coast indigenous populations by a third before the British even got here. So, yes, all this is born of genocide. Which, unfortunately, I think you will find is true of most of the modern nation consolidations. Some are worse than others. The settler ones tend to be worse. This all may seem like ancient history, but the view requires evidence of a historical break rather than continuity. Following World War II, thousands of possible tens of thousands of German fascists were recruited by the CIA. They were also recruited. There was also quite a few recuperated in the DDR, my friend. Now they weren't celebrated. It was kept secret. There was none of this celebration stuff that you saw about ex-Nazis that you see in the US. So I don't want to say it was the same, but it definitely happened. Klaus Barbie, the Butcher of Leon, helped the CIA torture and murder Che Guevara. True. Via the Cold War, German fascists essentially resumed their fascist project and leave with the Americans. German fascists were used by everybody. They were used more by the Americans, and the Americans were like not even a little bit. We weren't even a little bit hidden about it. Like, it was not a problem, but it was not unique to us. That's not an excuse for it. It's just to contextualize this. One of the things I don't love about American discussions of these kinds of events is that they tend to focus on America. And I get that, because like that's a society you can change. But it leads to very distorted views about the way Europe and the United States and Canada, and even in some ways the Criollo populations of Latin American states have been active collaborators and contributors to this larger, global capital imperialism from like moment one. I don't think Urie would disagree with me, actually. I'm just expanding the text. I don't know. Maybe he'll listen to this and get back to me and tell me how I'm wrong. Might lead to an interesting debate. I think he's like, so far, I don't disagree with what he's saying. I disagree only with the view that it was only done by the US, because it was not. But that actually helps his point. You see continuity everywhere, even in the places of the civilized free world. Former New York Times reporter and seemingly decent fellow despite his employment history, Eric Lichtblau, has written extensively on the integration of German fascists into American mainstream. Yep, read that book. There's a lot of it. It wasn't just Argentina that reintegrated fascists. There's weirdly a lot of fascists even reintegrated in particularly Ukrainian, but some others too, reintegrated in Canada. It's very strange. Look it up. All right. Interestingly, Lichtblau saves his most bitter recriminations for the aftermath of World War II. While the simple explanation it was the subject of his book, readers are encouraged to view Lichtblau's talk on the internet. You can read it in the source for details and nuance. Lichtblau charges U.S. General Patton was a vicious anti-Semite in the manner common to Western imperialists, or Westerners, period, frankly. September 15th, 1945, evidently the virus started by Borgenthal and Barak of a Semitic revenge against all Germans still working. Harrison and Izzo believe that the displaced persons is a human being. He is not. And this applies particularly to the Jews who are lower than animals. George Patton's diary entry. That's a good quote. Readers are invited to consider how this ties to the view from the Biden administration, CIA, and the MI16 that the Russians in 2023 are stupid, dirty people and that Americans could beat them in a fight, that we were innately superior. This is a leap. Everybody does this to their enemy. Again, this is not to say it's right. It's just super common. We are not innately superior to the Russians, obviously, nor are they a dirty, filthy people, and nor are they stupid. And this idea that Russia is uniquely backwards as a trans-historical thing, not because of its particular arrangement to the rest of the world, either in the Tsarist period of the Russian Empire, or in the Old Rush, or in the Soviet period, or in the post-Soviet mess that we have today, is just frankly ethnicism, if not outright racism, right? Totally agree with that, but it's not unique. Nor do I actually think that the Biden administration, the CIA and MI6 really thought that. I don't. I think they want you to think that. Do not confuse the enemy, a military power's propaganda, what it actually believes. There might be people in the military who drink their own Kool-Aid. There always are. But I don't think that was what was going on there. Again, hard to know. Maybe I'll get some damning diary entries later. We also remember that Patton was particularly problematic, even from the imperialist standpoint. They were afraid of him. Eternal with the army. All right. Again, hold any view towards the U.S. proxy war and claim that you care to. What this racist precept illustrates is presumptions of imperialist logic in respect to the deserving nature of those receiving end of imperial ambitions. Well, I would say it's the problem of national expansion, period, end of discussion. And this is how national expansions justify themselves. So I don't disagree with this. It's just not unique. But again, that doesn't hurt Urie's point. In fact, it actually helps him, because if we're talking about continuities in capitalism, well, capitalism is a lot larger than the fucking United States. As if on cue, Politico recently published an article entitled "Fighting Against the USSR Didn't Necessarily Make You a Nazi." Oh, yeah, that was embarrassing. Arguing even though the U.S. was allied with Russia in World War II, it would have been logical for U.S. Americans to attack their ally rather than the enemy. Democrat Hillary Clinton called for Americans with whom she disagrees politically to be re-educated, presumably in re-education camps. I don't believe that's what she meant. Similar to those created by American progressives who kidnapped indigenous children to assimilate them into broader culture. And the Canadian Parliament gave a standing ovation to a World War II era Galatian Ukrainian fascist who had been accused of war crimes. They absolutely did. The premise of the political article is a bit of an induction, proceeding from the idea that the wars fought over ideology rather than material conditions. I don't think you can separate ideology from material conditions, Yuri, but I get your point. I mean, material conditions is necessarily vague, and ideology is necessarily vague. I know you're going to go, no, it's not. Yes, it is. This ties to the post 2016 American liberal view that beliefs held by those who choose not to vote for Hillary Clinton in 2006 made them dangerous and not the meager politics they are able to craft. And author and activist Chris Hedges recently penned an article in which he articulated the fear that reelecting Donald Trump would result in an increase of political violence. However, causes matter. And this is why I've argued more than a decade that unless American capitalism is resolved with something like a return to the New Deal, fascism will likely result. I think it takes a lot more than a return to the New Deal, Comrade Urie, friend of the show. I don't know, you don't know me, but maybe you do, but I doubt it. I think that would only forestall the situation. I think the New Deal itself was the same kind of project. It's a less brutal one, and maybe that's what we need. And look, those kinds of reforms are. I'm no longer sold on the insurrectionary revolution as classically understood in the 19th century and early 20th century is going to look anything like we thought it used to look like. So, in that sense, yes, a New Deal would be good. But if a New Deal just stabilizes capitalism, which is mostly what it actually did, then the incremental politics are still going to be fraught. Maybe that's just what we need to do, is to kick the cycle of things being fraught back into the situation. But nonetheless, it is not an easy sell. However, this formation ignores the miserable American capitalism has been for Americans in good times. Counter to Hedges, whom I have had the highest regard for, the liberal field of political violence begs the question of what they have been for the last 3 centuries. Unless one buys the theory of American exceptionally, what elevates liberal violence above fascist violence? Yeah, nothing. It's all violence. It's all violence for interest, too. All right, we're going to stop here and we'll pick up on another section. Like and subscribe. If you like my engaging with these articles, I hope you share. Share us how this grows. I am no longer on Twitter. You can find me on Blue Sky at Varnblog. And that's probably really it. But share the show, like and subscribe. If you want to support me, find my Patreon. I do more of these there. You get my archives of prior stuff, including stuff I did before Varnblog. You get patrons only shows. We are reducing production here at Varnblog because while it was good for the YouTube algorithm, my audience was telling me they couldn't keep up with what I was doing, and two, I can't keep up with what I was doing. I'm writing papers on Christopher Lasch now, and getting the actual work on the Lasch book that I promised 4 years ago, so I had to take some time away from that and to devote time to my day job. You'll still get plenty of material. Don't worry. I think you're still gonna get 3 shows ish a week, 1 interview and 2 other shows of our shows with me and Jordin. But if you want more of that, like and subscribe, find the Patreon, find me there. I also am involved sometimes in member school, which I also suggest. And since I am doing this unprovoked, unsponsored, and he doesn't know I'm doing it, I didn't really ask permission, since it's a public article. If you want to check out the Journal Belligerent Pontification by Rob Urie, check it out, and maybe if you like this article, are interested in his thoughts on political economy, subscribe to Substack. So I'll push that too. All right. Thank you and good day. And we'll pick this up in part 2.